So welcome back as you start to come back in. It's traditional to start. Thank you. Yeah, it's traditional to start. You can come up, Angel. I'm going to just talk for a second. But it's traditional to start thanking people off in the end of a conference, but then no one gets to hear it, and et cetera. So I want to just give a couple quick shout outs to people who've really helped this day and this whole conference get going. First of all, Tina Stanton, who's been here as the executive director of the Hannah Arendt Center for many years. All of you who've worked with her know how invaluable and how amazing she is. Jana Mater, who's our new director of academic programming, has been essential here, so thank you very much. Phil Lindsay, who Daniel mentioned, who does our democracy work, but also is our director of communications, so thank you. Hillary Harvey, who runs our OSIN program and has helped bring a number of OSIN ambassadors here, along with Thomas Barcher, who's running the OSIN ambassador program, so thank you both to them. And then two returning students who are back and really been essential this last week, helping us prepare for this conference. One of them has been working at the conference for almost 10 years now as a returning student, Charlotte Albert and Tobias Hess, so thank you very much to them. And then all our student volunteers. It's great to see all the students involved, and that's really wonderful. One quick announcement. Some of you may have seen it. There's a beautiful print by an artist, Julia Chesko, called Speaking Truth to Power series, Words by Hannah Arendt. It was originally a painting, a work of art, and I liked it so much that I commissioned her, the Arendt Center commissioned her to make a limited edition of 50 prints. We're auctioning off one of them, $10 an auction ticket, and you can enter the auction and see the print. It's sort of a quote of Hannah Arendt's about speaking truth to power out at the table. So if there's an interest in that, I encourage you to join up. So we're going to begin now the last part of today's program, the afternoon program. We have two talks coming up. The first, I'm really thrilled to introduce Angel Adams Parham. Angel is a Associate Professor of Sociology and a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. She's the author of the award-winning book, American Roots, Racial Palimpsests and the Transformation of Race from 2017, and also The Black Intellectual Tradition, Reading Freedom in Classical Literature from 2022. She's been at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. She's the co-founder of a group called Nyansa Classical Community, and a lot of her work today is helping to create curricula in K through 12 schools designed to teach Black authors and Black writing and Black ideas. I met Angel at a conference last year in DC on federalism and local government, and she deeply impressed me there, and I'm thrilled she's made an effort to come and join us at our conference this year. Please welcome Angel Adams Parham. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you for the invitation. It's truly an honor to be here, and thank you to all of you for being here and sticking through a rather long day. So I wanted to just say a few words as a preface to why I'm interested in, why I'm going to be talking about civic friendship and social thought. So as Roger said, I am a sociologist, trained as a sociologist. I do most of my work on race. And about a decade or so ago, I became somewhat dissatisfied with the sociological tools that I had to try to understand issues of race and inequality, and what it is that makes this so difficult for us to have conversations around and to kind of build bridges between ourselves. And my very distinct sense was that there was something missing at the core of it. And so about a decade ago, I got introduced to the work of Danielle Allan, who's a political theorist who does quite a lot of work on friendship. And she's got a book called Talking to Strangers, which I think that's coming up tomorrow. And that's focused on issues of race and racial distrust. And it really got me thinking and got me into thinking about why is it that we don't talk about friendship in sociology? And so that's kind of a preface to what drew me into this. So the talk is going to be divided up a couple of ways. So the first part is more of a formal talk, which will kind of lead you through a kind of introduction to what I've been learning in terms of thinking with friendship in sociology. And then I will transition to a more conversational part where I want to kind of take some of the theoretical outline and make it practical in terms of some things that I've done in the classroom and in the community that have helped to kind of concretize these ideas. So what is it that holds us together amid upheavals of contemporary life during what Arendt would certainly concur are dark times? This question of social solidarity has long been central to sociology as a discipline, and attempts to address it have spawned numerous concepts and metaphors across the centuries, including organic and mechanical solidarity, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, imagined community, bridging and bonding social capital, and many others. What we do not see is anything like the idea of friendship. This is in stark contrast to the prevalence of the friendship metaphor in ancient and medieval political theory concerning what holds a community together. While it's beyond the scope of this talk to trace out the history of the decline of friendship in political theory, its decline was concomitant with the rise of modernity in the West and its greater focus on the individual, the state, and the people, and much less on the role of particular or general friendships that knit together our life in common. Arendt, however, is among those theorists who argued for the continued importance of friendship in our thinking about political life, our thinking about what binds us together. So in what follows here, I would like us to think with friendship. That is, to think about what it does to our understanding of what it means to live in political community with others, what it means to be bound together when we think in terms of friendship, rather than the kinds of mechanical, biological, or economistic terms often used across the social sciences. My reflections are divided into three parts. First, I make a case for friendship in contrast to other ways of conceptualizing what holds us together in political community by drawing on Aristotle's foundational concept of political friendship. I then consider how social theorists would benefit from bringing friendship back into their accounts. And finally, I conclude with concrete examples that demonstrate what it might look like to cultivate political friendship. So first, on the idea of political friendship. What is it that rubs us the wrong way when it comes to thinking in terms of friendship as the glue binding together political community? Because I think it does rub many people the wrong way. It certainly did me. So when I was first introduced to Aristotle's concept of civic friendship or political friendship more than a decade ago, I was really thrown off. How, I wondered, can I think of unknown others as friends? And even with Aristotle's suggestion in Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics that about 100,000 friends is likely to be the limit for political friendship, I can't really imagine knowing, or truly liking 100,000 people. So what, I wondered, could this possibly mean? I thought, maybe friendship's not quite the right analogy here. Well, I now think that my initial impression was very mistaken, and Aristotle, unsurprisingly, knew better than I did, and I'm grateful to have stayed the course to learn more about what he was wanting us to understand. Of course, part of my problem was a limitation of the English language. Book 8 of the Ethic notes, quote, "There are three kinds of friendship equal in number to the qualities that arouse love." And the Greek language wisely provides several different words to describe varied kinds of love. And so we don't have that kind of nuance in English for the idea of different kinds of loves and friendships and so on and so forth. So Aristotle distinguishes between friendships based on utility, pleasure, and goodness, but the language barrier wasn't the only thing that was the obstacle to my coming around to Aristotle's way of seeing things. Even in thinking about friendships based on these different relational foundations, I still confronted a mental block when thinking about friendship in a specifically civic or political sense. So what drove me back to the utility and aptness about a decade later to the idea of political friendship is the tumult and rancor that we've all witnessed since 2020, going into January 6, 2021, and right on into the present. people and associations I've known for quite a long while suddenly felt a need to position themselves on one or the other side of a starkly drawn ideological divide. There were reports of long-term friends and family defriending each other on social media, and I heard people who I knew to be of devout religious faith suddenly seeming quite unlovely in terms of their way of thinking about the other. So what on earth was going on? As I looked out with dismay on the contentious landscape of 2020 and beyond, Aristotle's concept of civic friendship kept coming back to me. I didn't yet fully understand it, but I was more and more convinced that there was something there to be carefully examined, mined, and treasured. I decided there to deeply engage with his writing on the topic and to place it into dialogue with some of the theorists I was more familiar with. In Book 9, he discusses the relationship between goodwill and friendship. And while goodwill is not the same thing as friendship, he says it paves the way. He explains people cannot be friends unless they first come to feel goodwill. Although feeling goodwill does not make them friends, because they only wish for the good of those for whom they feel goodwill, they would not actively take time or trouble for their sake. He goes on to suggest that goodwill might be thought of as underdeveloped friendship. Over time, with some effort, it may develop into friendship. Thus, the idea of this friendly feeling and goodwill put me further on the path to understanding what he was talking about, but there's another roadblock, which is how can one develop even a friendly feeling for obnoxious people? And there are just so many of them, right? So this is still a block for me. And indeed, Aristotle cautions us that the attempt at political friendship will only work if it occurs between good men, or in our parlance today, good people. Aha. Okay, so he writes, concord is evidently friendship between the citizens of a state because it is concerned with their interest and living conditions. This sort of concord is found among good men or good people because they are in accord with both themselves and one another, having, broadly speaking, the same outlook. For the wishes of such people remain constant and do not ebb and flow like the tides, and they wish for what is just and advantageous and also pursue these objects in common. But bad people cannot be in accord, just as they cannot be friends, since they are eager to get more than their share of advantages, while they fall far short in the performance of difficult tasks and public services. The consequence is that they are factious, putting pressure on each other, but not wishing to do what is right themselves. End quote. So, it does really matter what kind of people we're dealing with. Those who are truly bad will not make good civic friends, no matter how willing we may be to enter into such a friendship with them. I know many of us are not necessarily comfortable thinking in terms of good and bad people, so let's think of it this way. There are some among us who are cynically devoted to conflict because it provides opportunity for self-aggrandizement as they stoke the ire of those they seek to bring into their camp. You may know some of these people. Social media is tailor-made for such persons because it thrives on aggrievement, and it's structured by absolutes that call on one's passions to decide this day whom you will believe and serve. But I don't think most people are cynically devoted to whipping up conflict. Perhaps, therefore, we might slightly amend Aristotle's division between good and bad people and think more in terms of cultivating social experiences and societal structures that encourage the best and modify the worst in ourselves. With that brief overview in mind, I'm going to move now to kind of the sociological side of things, social theorists, and what I think they have to gain from bringing friendship back into their accounts. One of the major focus areas of the early social theorists who carved out the discipline of sociology in the 19th century was the question of social solidarity. They looked around at the social world and observed the tectonic political and economic shifts of the 18th and 19th centuries, with its industrial revolution tearing folk from their small rural communities and their reestablishment in comparatively large, anonymous, heterogeneous cities. As they did so, they were quite occupied with understanding what is it that holds us together amidst these epochal transformations. With few shared cultural, social, or religious foundations, upon what could social solidarity be constructed? In response, they proposed various kinds of analytic metaphors to capture what was occurring, but none of these invites the idea of friendship. They're instead conceived in rather sterile terms. Take, for example, Durkheim's distinction between what he called mechanical and organic solidarity. And these are ways of distinguishing between traditional and modern life. Within traditional pre-modern societies, people had much in common in terms of shared culture, religion, and norms, and life, therefore, was automatically or mechanically held together by those generally unspoken agreements on what it meant to belong to the community. With the rise and intensification of urbanization, which accompanied industrialization, quite suddenly different kinds of people enacting varied kinds of norms and practices that conflicted were living in close proximity to each other. And whereas before the agricultural household had met many of its own needs for food and clothing, now with urban life, it was necessary to depend on many, often anonymous others for those goods. So solidarity transitioned from being mechanical to being organic. And this organic metaphor is one of the body. Everyone functions as a different part of the body politic, allowing it to function smoothly. Then there are more recent sociological conceptions of solidarity that are also somewhat sterile and very distinct from friendship. Consider the idea of social capital, for instance. The concept's best known from Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, which was referenced earlier today, and it considers how our associational life has waxed and waned over the decades since the mid-20th century. Putnam is one of the foremost proponents of social capital, but this idea of social capital is very widespread throughout the social sciences. Bonding social capital occurs with our closest intimates, close friends, and family with whom we have strong affective ties and much in common. Bridging social capital occurs with those we don't know as well, but whom we encounter in secondary associations like schools and workplaces. We might not be in close relationship with them, but our presence in their social orbit conveys opportunities that allow us to gain from the social and cultural resources they have access to. In a very real way, then, when we think in terms of social capital, our family and our associates are transformed into units of social and economic value that we use to advance ourselves. Not exactly kind of the core of what we think of when we think of friendship. Thus, we have mechanical solidarity, organic solidarity, social capital, to name just a few. Neither the older nor the newer concepts carry the valence, richness, nor aptness that I think friendship carries for thinking through what it is that ails us now and what we most need to cultivate in order to move forward to a more promising direction. There's a real difference between the organism, the unit of capital, and the friend. And that difference lies partly in our visceral responses to each. While interdependent association and capital are important, no doubt, for our social life, they're quite sterile and abstract and only take us so far in getting to the heart of our current predicament. On the other hand, a friend is living and breathing. She has a physical presence, an ethos, a look, even a certain smell. She's not just a human being, she's an enfleshed human being with feelings and emotions who evokes in me a certain series of reciprocal feelings, emotions, and desires. The significance of these emotions and desires for the health of our political life is affirmed by the growing scholarship on the importance of affect and emotions in shaping the way we think and live our lives with others. Affect includes the viscerally positive and negative feelings we have toward others. Often these are non-rational, feelings that shape our conscious and unconscious thinking and acting. The concept of friendship, much more than any other metaphor for what holds us together, makes room for the somewhat intangible but deeply significant effects of affect, emotion, and desire in social life. The importance of affect in social life is affirmed by the work of a colleague of mine at the University of Virginia named Rachel Wall, who finds that in-person political talk across social and political divides works deep affective changes in participants, humanizing their disposition toward the political other, even as they don't change their own political opinions. On the surface, you might think, well, if the political conventions remain unchanged after all this political talk, maybe that talk isn't really worth very much. But nothing could be further from the truth. For what Wall finds is that two seemingly incongruous things are held together in a kind of beautiful but difficult tension. First, the political other is humanized and comes to seem a person worthy of interest, care, and concern, while secondly, that other's political position continues to be rejected. Too often what we see today is a dehumanizing, even a demonizing of both the other and their political opinion. There's quite a lot to be said then for the ability to hold in tension the interest and care for the other with a disagreement toward their political views. I'll close with some reflections on a line from Arendt's book, The Human Condition, where she writes, "Men are social before they are political animals." And this is an innovation on Aristotle's famous dictum, "Men are by nature political animals." By social, Arendt has in mind the underlying social structures and institutions that support our day-to-day living through reproduction, both biological and social. Notable here would be the family, the education system, and so on. The social and political are related in that social structures may be either more or less encouraging of the kind of open discourse characteristic of political friendship. The structures today that seem to play the largest role in shaping this terrain are social media and the platforms that increase our capacity and appetite for conducting our affairs at a distance, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic. These media structure our lives in ways that are radically different than even a decade ago, or even 3 years ago, pre-pandemic. More and more of our lives and our discourse are shaped by algorithmic determinations of what and who we see. And these algorithms bring riches to their creators by encouraging us to give in to our darkest fears and anxieties toward the other. These are precisely the pressures that push us away from friendship and toward what Arendt describes as fraternity, seeking out intimates who are just like ourselves. This could seem confusing because we tend to think of friendship and fraternity as being similar, both consisting of intimate ties with others like ourselves. But Arendt is drawing quite self-consciously on the Aristotelian concept of political friendship and not our everyday notion of the intimate bosom friend. We see this in her discussion of what is at stake when we give up on political friendship and retreat to our places of similarity and comfort. She writes, "We have seen what a powerful need men have in dark times to move closer to one another, to seek in the warmth of intimacy the substitute for that light and illumination which only the public realm can cast. But this means that they avoid disputes and try as far as possible to deal only with people with whom they cannot come into conflict." Lessing was never eager really to fall out with someone with whom he had entered into a dispute. He was concerned solely with humanizing the world by incessant and continual discourse about its affairs and the things in it. He wanted to be the friend of many men, but no man's brother. We are beset today by growing polarization in our own dark times, and a good deal of this polarization is racial in nature. In Talking to Strangers, Daniel Allan laments a palpable increase in racial distrust and calls for new habits of citizenship that aim toward political friendship. I'll close by relating two experiences that highlight the importance and possibility of political friendship amid the challenges we face today. And so here's where I will switch back to a more conversational tone and share with you a couple of quite interesting experiences and experiments. So the first is that I teach a lot of, in sociology, occupational hazard, you teach a lot of depressing things, all right? So I taught social problems over and over and over again. And I always made service learning central to what I was doing. I wanted the students to get out of the classroom and have a sense of, what we were studying in the community. I decided, however, right around the time I was saying, there's something missing from these sociological accounts, to create what I called the community host program. And so the community host program consisted of people from the community. In this case, it was Black women from the community I lived in. This was when I was still in New Orleans, where I was for 18 years. And I lived in a community that was very low income, that was beset by many social and economic challenges. And I went to a church that intentionally brought people together across lines of race and class. And so, two of the women that I knew from this church and this neighborhood, I said, would you become basically my co-instructors? So I'm going to give my students the option, instead of doing service learning, you can do 5 sessions with what I called a community host. And so you would have to go to this community host house in the neighborhood where they live and basically just listen as they share with you their own life experience related to what we're learning in the class. And what this did is it made it so that my students were not now, the ones swooping in from on high, carrying out this service for under-resourced others. They were instead having to listen with these community hosts being the experts and sharing with them their lives. And so I made this into a research project as a good sociologist and collected reflections from my students. And so I want to share with you some of their reflections. Something that I've come to realize from being a part of this program is that as different as a person's upbringing may be from my own, we can still be friends. But I hadn't had the opportunity to sit down and get to know someone living in a different situation like that. That there wasn't particularly a time or a place where I could do this. After spending so much time with Kiana, I would consider her a friend. So I opened this whole community host program with asking students, do you have anyone you'd consider a friend who is very different from you, particularly in terms of class, but also in terms of race? And most of my students did not. And part of it, this quote gets at, that there just was not a context for that. And so creating the context made it possible for them to literally enter the home and share the table with someone that they never would have been able to before. Amina says, there were many things I did enjoy about the community host program. To start off with, we built a family inside Miss Kiana's house. In a world that too often tells us to segregate and that we do not belong together, we were able to create a family of all kinds. We sat in that house and talked about real-life problems that are ignored in everyday conversation. Laura has, kind of a more edgy approach to this. She says, though it was inspirational to hear about society from her point of view, it became challenging at times to know that those things actually occur in real life. Hearing about these same things from Deja, the other community host who has gone through them, make them more realistic and even intimidating, as this can happen to anyone. And the final reflection comes from Lewis, who I think really put this all into he really crystallized the significance of it. Even with the best intentions in mind, the question of whether or not I will develop enduring relationships with people in low-income communities is one that cannot be easily answered. College is the only reason I have an entry point into Kiana's community. If I had not chosen to take this class, the meetings, revelations, and all the good times I shared with Kiana would never have come to pass. If I truly intend to create enduring friendships and relationships with people living in low-income situations, I will need to change my current level of outgoingness and get involved with the community. This past summer, I worked in one of 2 offices every day of the week. I saw the same people, sat in the same chair, and hung out with the same friends on the weekends. As I trudged through endless 9-to-5 shifts, I learned how easy it was to become locked in a routine that would prevent new interactions and connections from being made. Quite honestly, it scared me. What I can do is work towards expanding my social comfort zone with every new acquaintance and not shy away from opportunities to make new friends, and I tend to do this. So I think I'll forego the second one. It might come up, the second reflection might come up naturally in conversation. But what I'm suggesting is this creation of spaces can serve as kind of training wheels for a political friendship in terms of thinking about more distant others who we don't interact with, but who may come from similarly different backgrounds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angel. It's fascinating. And I love, and it's really nice to come up talking about this after tragedy. And so this works really well. I wanted to start because I loved, it's just the way your mind works, and I love how you do it. You started with this broad question of solidarity, right? And in a way, that's the question that Arendt is writing about as well, which is, once the world of, once the world is, the pillars of the world are broken, the pillars of tradition, how do we rebuild solidarity? And and this question becomes a live one, as you said, with Durkheim and Putnam and others. And you were interested in this idea of friendship, and you asked this question: what is the bond of political friendship? And you said it rubbed you the wrong way, which I think is great. But first, I guess the first is, okay, yes, you said because how could you be friends with 100,000 people? But is there anything else about it that rubbed you the wrong way? Is there any more visceral, or was it just that abstract question? I mean, is it, I mean, there are a lot of people, I think, who would say friendship, no, I believe in procedures. I believe in institutions. I believe in laws. And I'm just wondering, was that part of your hesitancy? Because you didn't really talk about that. And I'm wondering where that comes in.
Yeah, I think there was a visceral reaction against it, just because when you think of friends, again, I did not initially have in mind the very complex, multi-layered approach that you get in the kind of Greek tradition. And so I really just had our everyday use of the idea of friendship. And, and again, there are just plenty of obnoxious people.
I love that.
People that I would not normally want to, kind of just engage. And this is part of the second reflection that I might talk about a little bit in a moment, in terms of really coming into relationship with the political other who holds views that you find actually repugnant. And so this idea of quote unquote friendship being something that I could imagine with such people was really quite difficult to imagine. So it really did take some doing. Like I said, it wasn't really until 2020 that I started, it just kept coming back to me over and over again, this idea of political friendship, and particularly Danielle Allan's work, because she's the way I was introduced to it.
So you can tell me you don't want to talk about this if you don't want, but have you been able to have a political friendship with someone you find obnoxious, repulsive? I mean, you don't have to mention names, I'll give you that. But I mean, there's no doubt that in the last 5 years, I have had this experience. I think many of us had, more than we probably had in the last 40 years, those of us who have those 40 years. And I'm wondering what you thought of it. What's your experience of that kind of relationship?
Well, I do indeed, Roger. I do indeed. So this was the second thing that I was going to talk about that I thought maybe would just come up naturally. So this is a big preface. So I was in New Orleans, like I said, for 18 years. I was a professor at a small liberal arts college there. But at the same time, I was also homeschooling my daughters. So I homeschooled them for 13 years. Which was quite interesting, the kind of dance that I did to work full-time and homeschool them, but we managed to pull it off. You may or may not know very much about homeschooling. I love homeschooling, so I have no issues with it. However, when you are homeschooling in Louisiana, that means that you are likely going to be in certain circles that African American women at liberal universities are usually not in. Right? And so it was pretty much what you might imagine. It was largely white, a very kind of particular slice of evangelical white conservative. And I say this, again, not to put anyone down. I myself am also a very deep person of Christian faith, so it wasn't the Christianity that threw me off, but there's a particular kind of politics often that comes with white evangelical conservatism. And so those were the circles that I was in pretty continually. And so you kind of, I think in that sense, I was structurally in this situation where there was a possibility of developing this kind of friendship, that it's not, again, not bosom buddies, but it really came to the fore with the pandemic, all right? So 2020, everyone turned into homeschoolers, basically. But the original homeschoolers like us, we really didn't miss a beat. So we just kept going with everything we'd been doing. There weren't many masks around. And of course, in the group that I was part of, there's a very big politics that was often anti-mask, very anti-vax, or suspicious of vaccination, and so on and so forth, all right? So there was an outing where my daughter's homeschool group, they invited us out to the farm and had a big bonfire. And, you know, I won't go into the details of the conversation, but I would say it was a pretty Trump-friendly crowd, and I certainly stood out. I don't think that I was treated in any bad way at all. You know, I think we had good conversation. It was fine. Lots of conversation about the pandemic, lots of concerns about the policies and so on, and I kind of just listened. I moved shortly after that. A year later, my host, who had invited us all out, turned into the largest donor to my nonprofit that I have who is not a family member. And so that was completely a shock to me. I wouldn't have imagined that, right? And so I think the years and years that I spent in those homeschooling circles in Louisiana has allowed me to be able to think beyond what I would think if I were only exposed to those folks through the media. That doesn't mean that I agree politically. You know, it doesn't mean that I don't look askance often, but it does mean that I have some kind of long-term exposure and can have those conversations.
That's really, thank you for sharing that. I mean, we talked both in a couple of the talks this morning, we talked about friend-enemy, we talked about respect as sort of a quality of friendship where you don't have to esteem the person, you don't have to like the person, but you have to respect them in some way. Does that ring true? I mean, because I think some people say, no, if I'm going to be a friend with someone, I've got to sort of like them. There's something I've got to like about them, or there's something I've got to esteem about them. Aaron would say, no, you have to respect them as an individual. How do you navigate that divide?
So, I think, you know, even Arendt did have a limit, you know, in terms of if this person is actively working to destroy the world, you know, maybe we can make an exception with that kind of person. So I do think that there are limits of some sort. But again, I don't think that's most people. You know, even people who hold views that I really find even sometimes dangerous, you know, if you were to have a large group of people like them in charge. I think respect, I think yes. I think it's possible to respect someone without even liking them. But I guess part of the way I come at this, and the talk I gave today is part of a larger piece that I'm working on. And in that larger piece, I talk about the work of Anna Julia Cooper and Martin Luther King Jr. As models for us in terms of thinking about political friendship, particularly when it comes to issues of race. And so what I tend to think about, and I alluded to it a bit in the talk, is something that King would talk about quite often. And this goes back to Aristotle talking about you can only be political friends with good people. And so that amendment that I made is that maybe it's not so much good and bad people as it is drawing out and putting into place social structures that help us be more likely to be able to draw out what is good in them. And so what I would tend to think is more in those terms, is that this may be a person who I find their views to be quite objectionable. Is there anything in them that is good that I can kind of build on or draw out? Is there any way in our conversation that I can make some kind of connection that draws out the best of who they are and that kind of calls them to look into the best of who they can be rather than the worst of who they can be? And so I guess I would tend to think about it that way.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I think one of the things that I really found fascinating in your talk was when you mentioned this, I don't know if it was a study or I think it was your colleague.
Yes.
Who looked at the impact of in-person talking, and said that it doesn't change opinions, but I think you used the word humanizes the other. Can you say more about what that means to humanize the other?
Sure. Yeah, so this is Rachel Wall at UVA. She's wonderful. And so her work is on political talk. And so she had this question. People think that if you bring people together across differences and talk, it'll make some kind of difference. Maybe people will change their minds. She says, not really. Doesn't really seem to change anybody's mind. But what she found when she brought people intentionally, and she was working with college students, and she would bring them together across their political differences. And what she said is that then when she followed up with them later after they had gotten out of college, it was very interesting because many of them said, there's something almost dangerous about what we did because I came away from that time together. It made it harder for me to hate those people who are holding these views that I find to be very problematic or even dangerous. And they were disturbed by this because it's so much easier to just have this kind of anonymized other that you can cast your hate upon. They're just completely unreasonable, they're no good. But having been drawn into these ongoing conversations with them, having an enfleshed human being that they had some kind of even brief relationship with, it was not possible for them to just hate them as this anonymous other. And they said, actually, some of them said, it makes my organizing or my politics more difficult.
That's right. What this reminds me of is right after the election in 2016, I got a call from a local institution not far from Bard and said, we've been having these dinners around the topic of abortion, where we bring people on opposite sides of the issues together, and we've been doing it for a year. And we're all become sort of social and friendly, but it hasn't done anything. And we feel lost, and we sort of want to go back to not liking them. I think there's a lot of people who think this is bad, right? I mean, how are we gonna, has there been any reaction to people in her work or your work on this saying, we don't want to humanize, we want to demonize? There's obviously a lot of people who are what you call the cynical approach. How do people react to that, especially political people, activists?
Yeah. So there are definitely folks who kind of just feel like you need to put up the barrier and kind of you have to choose sides. Like injustice demands that you choose sides. This person stands for the bad, you have to stand for the good. Full stop. And I think there will always be people who feel that way. I guess I hope, or I choose to believe, that there is a larger group in the middle who are not quite so committed to being closed. But, and this is where it gets to, kind of what are the underlying social structures that encourage or discourage the kind of political friendship we're talking about? I think the majority of people, this is my theory, I hope I'm not wrong, but I guess I could be proved wrong. But my theory is that most people really kind of more are in the middle and could be, recruited to a way of thinking about the other that is more humanizing. But I do think that currently, especially the role of social media and algorithmic, ways of doing things makes it very, very difficult to do that. And what I see is that for so many people, they're very busy and they just rely on these things. They rely on the platforms, they don't have time to read very closely. For instance, I listen to podcasts of people I disagree with. I want to really understand their mind. I want to know where they're coming from. Sometimes there are things that they're saying that overlap with my values. They're not usually completely against my values, but there's a certain way in which they twist things or make things extreme that I find very concerning and very dangerous. But for me, I need to listen for myself because I find it very problematic to just have these straw men or women who are those people over there. And I think we could even look at this from, if you want to be really very kind of just self-centered about it, right? If you really care about your position, you can't adequately defend that position if you haven't adequately understood the position of the other. If you have just, taken a straw man or a straw woman version of it, you really haven't engaged it. And if you run into that person, it's going to be tackled and destroyed. And so for me, I need to know their language and be able to use their language in order to try to adequately communicate what I find to be problematic. And so that communicates in terms of respect. It communicates that, yeah, I have listened to, I understand, I can use that language, and here's why I think you're still wrong. So that's just how I think about it.
That's really, I think that's absolutely what we all need to do, and it's really nice to hear. I have another 10 questions, but I'm going to let people ask some questions because I'm sure there's some questions in the audience. So your hand up in the back, I think it's a student. You're turning around, but it's you, yeah. Surprise, surprise. Let's, can you get him can you raise your hand again? Yeah, so you'll get a mic.
Thank you. Is that too loud? You talked very briefly about social capital. I just wanted to ask how social capital plays a role into making friendships, especially within different social and economic classes, and then adding on, how does social capital play a role into making friendships within, I guess, social media or new technologies?
Yeah, so social capital, I don't reject the utility of social capital. It's incredibly helpful and useful. I just don't think it does the same work as political friendship. So again, kind of bridging and bonding social capital is the major kind of division. And so bonding social capital would be those people who are like you in some way, often people that you can retreat to and recharge with, and they provide, psychic, emotional resources, perhaps other kinds of resources. The bridging social capital can be particularly valuable because it can give you access to people with resources that you otherwise would not have access to. And so you could find bridging social capital, you might find it in college, perhaps, So depending on what background you come from, especially those coming from a more modest background going to college, might develop a lot of bridging social capital that helps to advance them in the world. And those people can actually become really very good friends, right? And so it may move from being this kind of really strategic bridging social capital into really legitimately being friends. So there's not necessarily a hard distinction between social capital and friendship. You can have friendships grow out of the building of social capital. So I think the two of them can work together, but I think the two concepts also do different kinds of work.
Great. Yes, there's two questions over here. Steve and the young person in front of Steve. We'll do those two. Let's take the two questions together. Is that all right?
Okay, it might be three.
What?
I have both a conceptual and a practical question for you. The conceptual one, we've been talking about what red lines for friendships are. We want to be as open to the other as possible, but Arendt has red lines. We all have certain red lines. You discuss some, which would be, if someone's really trying to destroy the world, maybe that's a person I won't be friends with. Is this question conceptually similar to limits of toleration? That is, we can tolerate people only so far, but there are certain things that they might do that would lead us to be intolerant of them. So this, the language around toleration and friendship, I wonder if we can see what the relationships and contrasts are. That's one. Two, more practically, I wonder if you have advice. I teach at Bard High School, Early College, Manhattan, and we are planning to have a forum next week for students to discuss the Israel-Gaza war situation. And the question would be how, with everyone in the same room, to promote the recognition of the humanity of each other, to promote common friendship and recognition of each other's concerns and anger and worries and fears, while not having it devolve into what we're seeing on social media, which is people announcing things, making claims more to pique the other than to attract the views, or to make one's views attractive to someone else who has a different view.
All right, thanks. And then are we taking the other? Okay, sure. Right, so toleration versus this idea of political friendship, I think that's a really good question. My initial thinking is that I do see a difference between toleration and the kind of political friendship we've been talking about, in the sense that toleration for me evokes this idea that I'm thinking of an example. All right, like someone is, distressingly ugly, but you're going to ignore, like to you, I'm not saying they're objectively distressingly ugly, but you find them to be distressingly ugly, and you're just going to pretend like they're not, right? But there's something that, it's something you can't ever quite get out of your mind because you just find them to be totally repugnant, but you're going to tolerate their presence. It feels a little different to me than the idea of political friendship, where I think what you're trying to do is to humanize the person, whereas if there's a sense that, oh, this person is, like, I can barely think of them as human, they're so ugly, and I'm just using this as an example. It doesn't really humanize them, it just means that you're just going to let them be in your presence, if that makes sense. And I think political friendship is different than just letting someone be in your presence. I think there's more to it than that. And so you're working really to find and to draw out the humanity in that person in a fuller way than I see with toleration. So that's what I'd say to that. The practical question, so I'm assuming the students you're bringing together have different politics around this? Right. I guess one of my questions would be how much of a foundation there already is relationally between the students. If there's already some kind of foundation, I would think that would already help, and kind of do some of that work of carrying along the conversation. If it's something where you're only a few weeks in, since we're at the beginning of the year, and you haven't really built that foundation, then I would think, trying as much as possible to build on that foundation, even just every way that you structure it, to kind of build on whatever has been created so far, right? So presumably some kind of relationship that's more amicable has already been created since a week ago, and to really recall that to their remembrance, to really think about, these are the people that you were already building relationship with, right? And so to not then kind of retreat into these silos, but to try to think more in terms of what was already there. And is it the case that things are radically different now that this political difference has come out? So that would be my best advice in terms of at least trying to set the foundation.
I just add one thing. I wonder what you think of it, which is that in civic citizen assembly work, but also in things we used to do called living room conversations, often the first exercise we have to do is about values, not about your opinion on an issue, Israel, Palestine, or whatever. And so to ask them to all just state what their core values in their lives are. And that's a way of humanizing everyone. And I wonder if you've tried something like that and what you think of that as a approach.
I haven't done that specifically, but I think that makes a lot of sense.
Hi, I'm Abigail. I also go to Bard High School, Early College, Manhattan. I kind of had a question regarding, I think, when you were asked how you can respect someone but not necessarily like them. I think you had mentioned how, like, at some point you kind of just look and like scavenge for points or parts of themselves that like kind of bring out the best in them and also can bring out the best in you. At what point do you feel like there is no longer a point to continue scavenging for those like good ideals and good points, or is there even a point? Because I think that like this whole conference is talking about how like friendship is like an integral part of like our humanity. So should there even be a point of stop scavenging? Like should we continuously scavenge in order to like set the stage for other people to continuously like look for more points in other people as well? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So I go back to when I was talking about Aristotle saying that you can only be political friends with good people. So one of the examples I gave was that I do think there are quote unquote bad people. Now, here's how I would say. What I think of in our current context is people who are cynically devoted to manipulating our fears and our anger for their own benefit, financial benefit, benefit of status, political benefit, and so on. That is someone that I don't think there's much we can do with that person, right? Because when I say that they're cynically committed to it, they have decided that, I know how to get more followers, more funding support. And this has actually been, I don't know how many of you have seen the film The Social Dilemma, but it's really very revealing. So it's all of these Silicon Valley giants who left Silicon Valley because they just couldn't do it anymore. They said, we knew from our research that the way to make the money was to play on people's fears and angers and prejudices. And so that's what we did, is that we built these platforms in ways that would help you to ramp people up in order to bring in the money. That is someone that I don't see taking time with, because you've decided to bring out the darkest in us so that you can make more money or have more fame or whatever it might be. And so that's the closest that I think in today's context we would get to what Aristotle means by bad people. Right? So in that case, there's not much that I can do.
One last question on the edge there, the back. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about the piece of advice that you just gave to the teacher who was wondering how to mitigate certain discussions between students with opposing ideals. Because myself, I've had very frustrating conversations with my peers who have used like infographics or social media and different like posts in absence of a well thought out opinion or an effort to actually research historical context. And you mentioned that it'd be helpful to remember that we had a relationship before these political situations, but I was interested to know your opinion about the idea that I think for at least my situation as a student of color in a predominantly white institution, the sense of like relationship that we have are oftentimes false, and the comfort or like the idea that we're all a community largely stems from white students who have kind of projected their own ideas onto students of color who oftentimes don't necessarily voice out their opinions because there aren't large political discussions to participate in. And so when we do have these conversations, they finally get to voice those opinions, and it's hard to kind of retreat back to those earlier stages of, oh, we were once friends, we once had agreements, but now we can't find those anymore. How do we still kind of reckon with those frustrations, and especially when it's about a situation as urgent as political or situations where people are dying and it's a very here and now problem?
So I want to make sure I understand. So you said that you feel like the sense of community has been a false one, and that students are drawn into a sense of false community?
Yeah, I think I was just wondering, how do you not let other people sort of make you retreat back into we were once friends, we once agreed? Because I think a lot of times it can be out of intimidation rather than a genuine agreement or feeling of connection.
So you're saying that those students who are in the majority try to get you to say, oh, we were friends, to try to get you to their side of things? I'm not sure if I'm completely understanding.
I might try to rephrase the question. I think I was just wondering, at what point do you draw the line between finding similarities with each other and trying to find the human in each other versus letting someone intimidate you into an agreement, or letting someone kind of quiet your disagreement into a larger, like,
Right.
majority held belief?
Sure. I don't think you should ever be intimidated into, I mean, that, no. There's a difference between actually having a discourse and you know when you're being intimidated into, or being silenced, or being kind of railroaded. That is not acceptable. In that case, I guess that would be another one where I would say, I guess we just won't be talking right now. Maybe there would be another time that I could talk to that individual, but not if that is what is going on. Not if there's an attempt to kind of actively denigrate, dismiss, intimidate, nullify your experience. Because the whole thing that we've been talking about is holding intention, right? Is that you being able to come forward fully as who you are and be able to express this and be respected in that, right? And so if they're going to expect that, they have to make room for you as well. So no, I don't see, and you don't necessarily have to say they're my sworn enemy for life, but I don't see a need to put oneself in that situation. So.
Please join me in thanking Angel Adams Parham.